Horizon Zero Dawn was an extremely successful game, and something we used quite frequently in our benchmarking suite. So when the news of the successor, Horizon Forbidden West, was coming to PC at long last after being a PlayStation exclusive, I thought it was only fair to see what performance was like on 40 different GPUs at 3 resolutions, 3 quality presets, and some upscaling kind of thrown in for good measure too. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits. Or, if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver. Thanks. But where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. Okay, so before we jump into the very lengthy charts and talk about kind of all of the data, let's talk about the game. Now, I won't lie and say that I've played it extensively because, well, I haven't, purely because my time has been put into benchmarking it. And while Steam will show that I've played it for many hours, that's just not the case. And instead has seen me doing the same repetitive run over and over to get the figures that we have here today. Beyond that, after spending some time on the Horizon Discord server, it does seem that people are loving the game. And the Steam reviews back that up too, coming in very positive, and seeing the game sit at the number 5 spot in the Steam top sellers list. The game is based on the Decima game engine, which is made by Guerrilla Games. And while it's not, let's say, the most famous game engine out there, it was used in Horizon Zero Dawn and Death Stranding, both of which have proven to be massively popular titles. While PlayStation gamers will be more than familiar with the game, it was only actually recently that we saw it being ported over to PC by Nix's Software, who are a Dutch-based developer who are known for porting the likes of Ratchet & Clank and the latest Spider-Man titles too, so Spider-Man Remastered and then Miles Morales. And overall, they've done a pretty good job, and that shows in Forbidden West, with I guess the only real issue that I found coming by the way of screen tearing, but nothing that kind of can't be fixed without fiddling with various settings in the game. Now, talking about the settings, much like Ratchet & Clank and the Spider-Man games, you do have a splash screen when you first load the game, which takes you to your settings directly, so you can tweak things before you actually get into the game. It's here where you get access to the resolution, enabling or disabling upscaling, dynamic resolution scaling, which did decide to enable itself halfway through my testing, and of course the quality presets, which can be set individually or you can manually change settings one by one, including motion blur, ambient occlusion, and general quality changes. In terms of upscaling, the game does have pretty extensive support, supporting DLSS, FSR 2.2 and Intel ZES, along with frame generation for NVIDIA-based cards, and that's something we'll look at a little later on. You get the typical upscaling quality presets ranging from ultra performance to quality on DLSS and FSR, while ZES has the options of performance through to ultra quality, though for our tests we settled on the balance mode to give the best offset of quality without sacrificing performance. In terms of quality presets, you have the option of very low, low, medium, high and very high, and this just increases the individual quality of each element, including textures, shadows, depth of field, hair, screen space reflections, water quality and cloud quality, along with enabling or disabling various settings to make the overall game just look prettier. And don't get me wrong, the game is stunning to look at in every aspect. In terms of the visuals, very low and low do take quite a beating, but obviously will help for those clinging onto older hardware who want to play the latest titles. And while the gameplay will be fluid, the visuals are going to suffer quite dramatically. Thankfully, the medium preset does make, I guess, up for quite a large difference, mainly in textures that before looked somewhat flat and without depth or shading. As you move up to high or very high, that's where the stunning visuals really come into play, with improved shadows, reflections, and just more depth to the textures of individual elements like the ground, leaves, trees, and water. For those wanting to experience the very best visuals without having the horsepower, upscaling can get you at least part way there. Though as expected, at lower resolutions, we do start to introduce the typical upscale issues of grain, blurring, and just overall latency issues. though some upscaling tech is clearly better than others in terms of that. Also, as I mentioned, if you are using a 40 series GPU, then this game does support frame generation from Nvidia's upscaling arsenal of technologies. And while FSR3 isn't supported at this time, Nixis have mentioned it, so it should be coming along in the future. But it's a shame how new titles keep coming out and are lacking on the AMD side. So, the reason you're all here, numbers, figures, and to see how GPUs do at various resolutions and settings. And to forewarn you, we have a lot of data that took us just short of a week to compile, with, by my calculations, over 360 individual runs. And that's without revalidating and retesting when we were presented with outliers. So it's definitely a lot of work. As a side note, if you do appreciate the huge amount of work that went into this and want to help support us, then you can over on Patreon, where you'll not only support what we do here, but also get access to the charts in their entirety, along with a ton of other really cool benefits, including exclusive behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, Patreon only live streams, and much more. The link is, as always, down below. Now for our testing, we used the GPU test system with an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D and 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB, 6000MHz CL30 DDR5 memory. For the motherboard, we used the Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with the latest BIOS version installed, along with Windows 11 on its latest update. Driver-wise, we used AMD's 24.3.1 driver, and for Nvidia, we used the 551.86 driver. We tested 40 GPUs in total, including all cards from the last two generations from AMD and Nvidia, along with a couple of older ones to see how they'd hold up. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting things off with 1080 medium, because upon testing, it does still seem that some good performance can be had, even on older hardware. So why limit yourself to low or even very low settings if you don't have to? It's here where AMD take the top of our chart, likely down to the driver overhead issues that come from Nvidia. That aside, we're good for over 200 FPS on both the 7900 series GPUs along with the RTX 4090, while lower end cards still manage to hit some pretty respectable numbers. The latest 7900 Gree from AMD manages to push out 4% more performance when compared to the RTX 4080 Super, but again at such a low resolution, this is likely due to driver overhead, where Nvidia suffers quite badly at times. Moving down further, we have the likes of the 6800 XT at 166 FPS, which essentially matches the performance of the 4070 Ti and Ti Super, but does have slightly better 1% low figures. Even older cards like the 2080 Ti from yesteryear are still good for 123 FPS, which puts it ahead of the 4060 Ti by 16%, and a slightly larger margin of 19% when compared to the RTX 4060 non-Ti. Moving even further down, we do find all but one GPU tested manages to hit 60 FPS, though the RTX 3050 really is on that limit, and the paltry 4GB 6500 XT sees our worst result yet, where it just basically falls over at 26 frames per second due to the lack of capacity in terms of VRAM. As we move up to 1440p, we can start to see that top spot under some contention, with the 4090 now sitting ahead of the 7900 XT and only 5% behind the 7900 XTX, though this should all change as we move up to 4K. Nvidia's 4080 Super is now pushed ahead of the 7900 Gree by 6%, now coming in at 147 frames per second, along with just over half of the cards tested still giving us performance in excess of 100 FPS. Older 30 series and 6000 series GPUs do start to slip ever so slightly, but the likes of the 2080 Super is still good for 76 FPS, now matching the performance of the newer and current generation 4060 Ti, as well as the 5700 XT from AMD still managing to push out 66 frames per second. There are some cards that now don't make the cut, like the 6600 at 55 FPS, the RTX 3050 at 43 FPS, and the 6500 XT has just slipped even further, and is now essentially unplayable. Also, the 3060, while it did pack 60 frames per second, 4K or higher quality probably won't be as kind to it. At 4K, where the GPUs are working their hardest, we now see the 4090 taking its top spot at 109 FPS, which puts it just 3% ahead of the 7900 XTX, while the 7900 XT still comes in strong and pushes out 6% more frames than the 4080 Super. Cards like the 6950 XT still manage to get a respectable 82 frames per second, essentially matching the performance of the 3090 Ti, while plenty of other cards are still good for 60 FPS or higher, including the RTX 3080 10GB and 6800 XT at 66 and 67 FPS respectively. It's crazy to see that even on medium, newer cards like the RTX 4070 fall just short of the mark, and the 4060 Ti only comes in at 42 FPS, and now matches the performance of the much older 2080 Super, likely due to the 8GB VRAM buffer, where it shows newer titles like this just make the cards suffer. While lower frame rates like we see on the RX 7600 and 5700 XT come in with a 1 FPS difference, it is still playable to a degree, but you can start to notice overall gameplay just doesn't feel as fluid, and you'd expect better performance on newer hardware like the RTX 4060, with its only saving grace coming by way of upscaling, potentially. Beyond that, we now see more cards drop below 30 FPS, including the 6600 and RTX 3050, and that 6500 XT, which has consistently been the worst card we've tested, now sitting at sub 10 FPS on this preset. Cycling back round to 1080p, but this time on the high preset, the 7900 XTX again comes in at the top of the chart, with 5% more performance than the RTX 4090. The 7900 XT still manages to best the 4080 Super by a 6% margin, and the 6950 XT is still well up there in terms of performance, just 3 FPS behind the RTX 4080. We still have almost half of the cards exceeding 100 frames per second, with the most noticeable being the 7800 XT, which shows its fantastic value based on the performance that we see, as it falls just behind the 4070 Super and packs 7% more performance than the RTX 3080 10GB. A card that was significantly more expensive when it launched. All but 4 cards now present more than 60 FPS, with the RX 6600 just falling short, though it's unlikely you'd ever notice during gameplay, whereas the more noticeable performance drops are on the RTX 3050 at 41 frames per second, that could see it dip lower in the more intensive areas of the game. As we move up to 1440p, the 4090 takes the top spot, though we're talking a margin of error 1 frame per second difference over the 7900 XTX. AMD still comes in the better of the older GPUs, with the 6900 XT falling 2 FPS behind the newer 4070 Ti Super, which isn't great for Nvidia in the grand scheme of things. The 6800 XT is also displaying very strong performance, as it sits in the same realm as the 7800 XT, showing that the uplift in performance generation to generation doesn't really account for much in this title at this level of performance. Older GPUs like the 2080 Ti still give some solid numbers at 67 FPS, which puts it a pretty stark 16% ahead of the newer RTX 4060 Ti, which only just manages to creep past the lower end RTX 2080 Super. Beyond that, a lot of GPUs are now sitting sub 60 FPS, while the 3050 still manages to cling on at 31 FPS, though again, more intensive parts of the game could result in a subpar experience overall. 4K on high is where we see some of the biggest drops in performance, with no GPUs coming in above 100 FPS. In fact, we now see the 4090 taking the top spot at just 91, followed closely by the 7900 XTX, which sits just over 5% behind. In terms of surpassing 60 FPS, we now have only 11 GPUs ranging from older but still high-end 30 series cards like the 3080 Ti and 3090, still managing to just scrape by to the 6950 XT, which now pushes just ahead of the RTX 4070 Ti Super. Below 60 FPS, which is still playable, we find newer cards like the 7800 XT at 56 frames per second, followed behind by the RTX 4070 Super at 55 FPS. The 2080 Super still does reasonably well at 33 FPS, which puts it 10% ahead of Nvidia's 4060 and 4060 Ti, which both come in identically at 30 frames per second, which isn't great considering the much older 5700 XT only comes in 7% slower. Further down, we now have a smattering of 6000 series cards around 20 FPS, and now in the frankly unplayable realms of performance with the 6500 XT, now feeling somewhat like a slideshow presentation, it comes in at just 6 FPS. As we move to 1080p on the very high preset, I will say that performance and overall visuals didn't actually change much. Looking at the 7900 XTX for instance, which tops our chart, we only saw performance drop by 1 FPS going from high to very high. Other cards like the 4090 actually saw performance increase, with it having the ability to stretch its legs just that little bit more. And this really comes down to game optimization and drivers, which as we've seen before in games, does get better over time. So game patches and driver improvements should see bigger differences in the future. That aside, we do still see a lot of cards surpassing 100 FPS, including some older, more mid-range cards, like the 6800 XT at 114 frames per second, which means that it only sits 4% behind the RTX 4070 Ti. Below 100 FPS, we have the likes of the 6800 at 94, followed closely by the 7700 XT. Then the 2080 Ti still holds up well, matching the performance of the 6750 XT and 3070 Ti at around 87 frames per second. And the majority of the cards, including the relic 5700 XT, still manage to hit a minimum of 60 frames per second, while the 6600 and RTX 3060 sit 4 to 5 frames below. At 1440p, the top spot is still under contention between the RTX 4090 and 7900 XTX, with just a 3 FPS margin between them. Again, the older 6000 series cards still show that they are more than up for the task, like the 6950 XT at 106 FPS, and the slower 6900 XT at just under 100 frames per second, only being beaten in terms of newer cards by the 4070 Ti Super by just 3 FPS. We do still have the majority of the cards tested at above 60 frames per second, ranging from the 6700 XT and 2080 Ti upwards, so there's still some life left in them yet. While some cards fall just below that, including the RTX 4060 Ti at 57 and the RTX 4060 non-Ti at 50 frames per second. At 1440p on very high, there's only 2 cards that actually sit at 30 FPS or lower, being the RTX 3050 and of course the lowly 6500 XT, which is now really struggling due to its lack of VRAM. Lastly, at 4K on very high, the 4090 retains its top spot at 90 frames per second, with the 7900 XT now sitting 8% slower. It then starts to drop in a sizable manner, with the 4080 Super and 7900 XT evenly matched in performance, and the lowest performance 60 plus FPS card is the 7900 GRE, which further cements its value for money proposition. Below 60, however, we do see quite a few older cards, but also some 7000 series AMD cards like the 7800 XT at 54 frames per second and 4070 Super at 53 FPS. Again, upscaling, even on modest settings, will see this potentially bounce back up past 60 frames per second, but now we have 14 cards coming in with performance of 30 FPS or lower. And sadly, this includes the 4060 Ti, which matches the performance of the 5700 XT, and the RTX 4060, which matches the performance of the 3060 12GB. So, not great for Nvidia's latest 4060 series cards. Now, I mentioned at the start about upscaling, and I want to warn you now that, well, it's a hot mess. No matter if you're using AMD or Nvidia, there are some clear issues with performance when it comes to upscaling, and it being kind of even worse than native, as well as frame generation doing the exact same thing. But not on every card. After scouring the internet and looking at Reddit as well as the Horizon Discord server, other people are getting the same anomalies. So in all honesty, for these next charts, I would take them with the biggest handful of salt that you can find. And until they're fixed, I'd personally advise against using upscaling, unless you're one of the lucky ones who has a card that does see a performance uplift. So we also found that there was potentially an issue with Windows 11 and Windows 10 was absolutely fine. What we also noticed was CPU usage between using the game natively and using FrameGen and DLSS upscaling set to balanced. And it was very clear that when frame generation is on, the CPU usage is somewhat higher. And that's clear to see when we look at the game side by side. At native, the CPU usage is much more consistent compared to when frame generation is turned on, where CPU usage ends up going much higher and also fluctuates quite a bit more too. Either way, let's look at the charts, starting with 1080p, and for the most part there are some cards that give some uplifts, like the 6600 XT, which sees a 5% uplift in performance with FSR enabled. This is nice to see, but nothing of the gains we'd expect to see based on other games. The 6800 XT sees better gains of just over 20%, and this is further proof that some cards are just nerfed in terms of upscaling. The RX 7600 is another one that frankly sees a margin of error difference and shows that upscaling just isn't working right when compared to what we see on other cards, like the 7900 XTX, which also sees a 14% increase in frames, but it's still nothing similar to what we've seen in other titles. Moving on to Nvidia, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. The 3060 Ti sees upwards of 31% increases, with the better uplift coming by way of DLSS and not FSR. And the same with the 3080 Ti, though the increase in performance is smaller at 24%, but definitely much more like it. Then we move on to the weirdest result, the RTX 4060, which originally came in at 69 FPS, which is pretty decent, but turning upscaling on in both FSR and DLSS mode actually saw performance drop by 9%. And then the even stranger thing is enabling frame generation, which saw it drop another 13%, meaning that the worst result, being FrameGen, was now 20% lower than native. So something is definitely wrong. Retesting garnered the same results, and speaking to the community, other people were seeing similar issues. The RTX 4080 Super is a card that seems to run fine with upscaling, as we saw between an 18 to 21% gain when enabling FSR or DLSS. And then FrameGen increased that margin by another 10%, which puts it 32% faster than the native result. So again, this card seems fine. Weird. 1440p wasn't much different. We do see a larger gain on the 6600 XT, but we are talking lower numbers overall, so percentages can seem inflated somewhat, with a 22% uplift. Then the 6800 XT was still holding strong with a 30% increase in performance when enabling FSR, and the RX 7600 seemed to have settled somewhat, but we're only talking 14% more performance overall, so still not great. The 7900 XTX saw the biggest gain from AMD with 24% more performance between native and FSR, and this seems to be one of the good ones that saw gains at all resolutions. The 3060 Ti saw even larger gains of 44% when going from native to DLSS balanced, with FSR just a little bit below, which is, I guess, expected, as DLSS generally gives us larger gains anyway. The 3080 Ti came in with an uplift of 31% when enabling upscaling with FSR and DLSS, separated by just a single frame. But the 1% low was stronger on DLSS than it was on FSR, so I guess you could chalk that up as a win for Nvidia. As we move back to the 4060, upscaling actually sees an increase this time with 8% more frames when using FSR, and 10% when using DLSS, so all seems to be fixed, until we enable FrameGen, where performance tanks, and actually now drops 18% below the native result, which again is frankly very weird and something that definitely needs addressing from the developer in conjunction with Nvidia. Then with the 4080 Super, which has been consistent in terms of uplifts, performance between native and upscaled sees an increase of up to 28%, with DLSS just edging ahead in the battle of the upscalers, while frame generation sees things move up again by 13%, which now puts it 45% faster than its native performance result. So again, things are looking really right on certain cards, but also really wrong on others. Then lastly, at 4K, things really start to fall apart. With the hope that the lower end cards could see some huge gains, that just doesn't happen, with the 6600 XT and 7600 actually dropping frames, and well, it becomes absolutely awful to game on, which I will show you shortly. The 6800 XT still sees a 46% uplift in frames, and that now puts it well above 60 FPS. And the 7900 XTX, while the gain is smaller, it's still impressive at 37%. The 3060 Ti, which was scraping past 30 FPS, saw no uplift with FSR enabled, so again, some big issues there. But DLSS saw an increase in performance of 36%, amounting to 11 frames per second, and that just leaves me with even more questions. Then, moving on, the 3080 Ti saw gains on both FSR and DLSS of between 43 to 47%, again in favour of DLSS, so some impressive stuff there, which again pushes things well past that 60 FPS number that it was just falling behind at when on native. And then again, the 4060 gets the award for the weirdest results, with FSR giving us a 13% uplift in performance, while DLSS improves on that and puts it 29% ahead of its native result, though again, low numbers so inflated percentages. But then it gets weird. Again, FrameGen shows that it's just not working, at least how it should be, as while we do see an uplift of 21%, it should actually be 30% or even higher, and it falls below DLSS with no FrameGen turned on. So yeah, some really strange results. Then lastly, the 4080 Super, which wins the Consistency Award, goes from 72 FPS to 99 with FSR, which is a 38% uplift in performance, and from 72 to 102 FPS with DLSS enabled, which is a 42% uplift. FrameGen increases that margin by 17%, which now means that we've managed to improve our performance over native by a whopping 65%. It's just a shame that not all cards saw similar gains. So I went into this video with some high expectations, and as it's gone on, there's some very clear and very big issues. So big in fact that we threw the 6600 XT back on to show just how bad the performance is at 14 FPS average. And it's just awful, but it does get worse. If we put FSR to ultra performance, it looks reminiscent of an old arcade game with blurry and unsharpened textures, almost as if it's like looking at the game with Vaseline smeared over your eyes. That aside, the performance was interesting. It certainly scales to a point when looking at the difference between medium and high, but as you move up to very high, things just, well, go out the window. The quality difference is minimal and the performance difference is in line at places with margin of error, so there's definitely some big optimizations that could be done. In terms of upscaling, it's a hard one to comment on, as some cards did see some healthy uplifts, and for the most part, that seemed to be the case on higher end GPUs like the 6800 XT, 7900 XTX and 4080 Super. While others did see an uplift, they were just somewhat smaller, or just all over the place. And that seemed to be the case in terms of the lower end, like the 6600 XT, RX 7600 at the higher resolutions, and the 4060 just in general. What is clear to see is that VRAM has a part to play in all of this, and your older 4GB cards, even without upscaling, are going to struggle a lot. And even 8GB I feel is on the kind of cusp, as in the area we were in, we were actually using more than 5GB of VRAM. And I'm sure there are more intensive areas that could see that dramatically increase. All in all, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And while I was doing my kind of main 40 GPU huge amounts of testing, I didn't really see major issues other than screen tearing. But it was when I started to delve a little deeper and look at upscaling that things just, well, didn't add up. And that was further confirmed when we retested and spoke to the community to see if they were seeing similar issues. So at least we know it's not just us. While I wouldn't straight out say, don't buy this game, I think there's definitely room for reservations. And depending on the GPU you have, you may not get the performance that you'd be expecting. Hey, maybe AMD knew there were issues, and that's why FSR3 with frame generation hasn't been added. But in all honesty, that's likely just a coincidence and timing. And I guess that's potentially turned into their good fortune, that gamers can't hate on them. And while I'm not blaming Nvidia, there is definitely work to be done between Nixes, mainly, and with help from Nvidia. I'd like to think things will drastically improve in upcoming patches, but all things aside, those updates need to come thick and fast. Or those glowing reviews at the moment on Steam could turn south very, very shortly. For now, that's going to wrap this one up. I wish it was a better conclusion, but as always, we can only display the data that we're given. And even after retesting, revalidating, and checking with others, it seems that they are what they are. And until it's fixed, yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do and appreciate the huge, monumental effort that went into all of this testing, like I say, 40 GPUs, 3 resolutions, 3 quality presets, and upscaling, 360 plus tests, then you can help support us over on Patreon. You'll get access to all of our charts, exclusive behind the scenes content, a super special area on the official eTeknix Discord, bi-weekly game nights, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.